Welcome to the Business of Betting podcast. Today I'm joined by Adam Blencowe. Adam, thank you very much for coming on. Before we get into this episode, make sure you follow us on Twitter, @BettingPod, and check out the website, businessofbetting.com. Guest suggestions are much appreciated. This podcast is proudly sponsored by Betfair Proprietary Limited. Betfair operates a betting exchange and is licensed in the Northern Territory of Australia. Residents of Australia can join Betfair by visiting betfair.com.au and support this podcast by using promo code BOBPOD. Please gamble responsibly. So thank you for listening, and I hope you enjoy this episode of the Business of Betting podcast. Today I'm joined by Adam Blencowe. Adam, thank you very much for coming on.
Yeah, pleasure, Jake. Thanks for having me on.
So, Adam, what was your first foray into betting?
So I'm one of those that was kind of born into it, I suppose. The family tree sort of scattered with bookmakers and old tales of the SP, if you like. But probably the most direct influence of mine was my old man, who worked with he's a bookmaker himself, worked with Colin Tidy at City Index and Con Cafetaris at Sport Odds and a few other. I was, I suppose, exposed to some pretty sharp people. He had a team around in there that were, there's some pretty good betting minds there. So from a young age, I was sort of exposed to some pretty smart betting folk, and I suppose that was where I was sort of always destined to head.
So were you on course with your old man, or what was a typical sort of weekend in your teenage years?
No, so Dad was probably at the start of the sort of corporate game, if you like. So he was in an office at the race course at Canberra, so I go out there a little bit, sort of thing. But it wasn't sort of it wasn't a board at the track, if you like. It was the start of mostly phones back then, but it was the start of that sort of phones and heading towards online. So the game was probably changing, but yeah, it was I got out there a little bit, and obviously speak to the old man about these things all the time. So I had that sort of little introduction to betting from a young age. Dad was also my personal bookmaker in the younger years there, 50 cents the place punter with the old man. So he took plenty of my action back in the day as well. So yeah, I was an early ager, if you like, and sort of always heading down that path.
I hope he was giving you 100% markets.
Yeah, and I never had to pay, which was handy. So I was on a good wicket there.
What was most enjoyable back then for you? Did you just like having a place bet here and there, or did you like reading the form guide and trying to pick out the right factors, or was it pretty simplified for you in the early stages? Yeah,
I suppose, as a kid, it's certainly more about, horse racing. It's more the aesthetics of it all, I suppose, and just sort of sitting on the couch with Dad having a bet and a punt and a bit of fun. So I think that's probably how a lot of people sort of get into it. I didn't sort of get serious about it for quite a while, so I ended up sort of, I was sport footy on the weekends and school and what have you, and just drifting along. I ended up working in the bank and heading down the path of a life of finance. I'd probably be sitting in front of a Royal Commission had I not sort of stumbled into a job at a small corporate myself, which is Portland Bet, which is a Canberra racecourse as well. So I stumbled into that. It was only a small little corporate bookmaker, but again, there were some smart people there, and I learnt a lot, and there were some I probably learned a little bit about what not to do as well, but because, as I said, it was a small sort of joint, it was very hands-on. So from straight away, I was sort of thrown in the deep end a little bit there. I was working nights and managing books on European soccer and US sports. I was probably hugely underqualified, but got to learn on the job. So that was probably a little bit of a fast track into the betting world as well.
What did you learn most there? Were you handicapping horses, or were you just doing what a young, employee of a relatively small bookmaker doing, which is probably everything, I'm guessing?
Yeah, it was small, so it was sort of everyone sort of to the tools sort of thing and having a go. And yeah, as I said, horse racing, I was probably more sport at that point, to be honest. And, I still had an interest in the horses, but it had never grown beyond, the days of just having a punt on the horses on a Saturday sort of thing and betting the carnivals, that sort of thing. So, I was probably more sport at that point, but I was working nights, as I said, a lot of European soccer and stuff like that. And I think it was working those nights, a lot of long, cold hours in the middle of July in Canberra. And I sort of started watching, sort of fell in love a little bit with the English and French racing and through the night there, and then started trying to find winners. And that's probably where I started to drift and maybe a little bit away from sport and sort of really get sort of stuck into the horses.
Did you have a mentor or a teacher in terms of handicapping and looking into, I guess, European horse racing? There probably wasn't a lot of people around to sort of guide you through that.
No, I was on the fly a little bit. I always had Dad, but so from there, I suppose the working those nights became fairly tiresome, and the lifestyles are, a little bit rough around the edges. So I ended up getting in touch with Gary Crisp at Racing and Sports, and just mentioning that, I'd found Racing and Sports online and was using the website. So I just got in touch with him and said, look, I'm using the website. I'm a fan, if you like, and I'd be interested in doing a little bit of work for you guys, because I knew they were in Canberra. So I got an interview there with Gary, and that was probably where, I probably had no idea there. Gary still reminds me that I had no idea at that point in time, but I walked in the door, and that sort of started off on the journey.
Now that you know a lot more, what are the core differences between European horse racing and Australian horse racing? If you want to make money at either, is there stark differences, or is it, the same core principles apply? You've just got to figure out the nuance.
Yeah, I think that's right. I don't think there's a huge difference. I think I'd probably have some sort of advantage in having an idea about the English and French racing, and an idea about the Australian racing, and being able to take those ideas across. So have a bit of an Australian look at an English race, and an English look at an Australian race probably doesn't hurt. But at the same time, I couldn't claim to have any silver bullet there. It's still just, A to B, I suppose. There's slight differences, as you say. There's nuance, but I don't think there's probably there's no trick to it, if you like.
Okay, so we've seen some Aussie sprinters go over there and just go straight to the lead and win, essentially, or sit right on the pace. Is it different if they're coming from behind? Do they have to adjust to different tempo and, different riding styles and things like that, even different training styles? Yeah, well, there's certainly different training styles, but I think that we've obviously had a lot of success with our sprinters over there, and that's generally what we're good at, and we stack up really well over there. I think it's true that we are, muscle twitch athletes down here, and then we go really quickly, but over there it's probably a little bit more sedate at the very beginning, and they slowly ramp it on up, whereas here we're sort of scramble out of the gates, take a quick hold, get a breather, and then blast home, whereas over there it's a slow build. They're off for home. They're at their top a lot further from the winning post than we are here. So that's probably a slight difference. But our horses have tended to adapt to it pretty well, I think. I think in the end it's a bit of a case of I think more races over there are probably won by the best horse, and over here maybe tactics and jockeyship plays a little bit more of a role. But again, I don't think it's a hard and fast rule thing. I think it's, as you said before, just a little bit of nuance. So how would you grade the internationals coming for the Melbourne Cup? Obviously distance race, if the idea is that they're probably a stronger animal over 2 miles. In general, do you think they've underachieved? I suppose so. They're probably only 1 or 2 wins away from being overachievers, though. It's still, it's been going since 1993, hasn't it? So there's been a lot of them, but it's still a relatively small sample size, I suppose. So I don't think, I certainly don't have any issue. I'm not thinking that, you shouldn't be backing English horses in a Melbourne Cup or anything like that. I think they'll find their turn, and they may well find it this year. They've got a pretty strong team coming this year, I think, and the vibes around Australia are all pretty forlorn at the moment. I don't think we have a huge defence for it. So, the English will get their turn. I don't think maybe they've underachieved slightly, but it would only be very slight. So what are the core tenets of your handicapping? If you don't mind just taking us through some of the main components that you rely on to grade a horse or a race or a race day. Yeah, so ratings are my go, and that's time form ratings is sort of the most prominent, if you like. So we produce those at Racing and Sports. It's basically taking all the key variables we can and everything. Basically, we want to measure all the objective variables and sort of condense them down into one key number. So, I don't think there's, again, as I said, I'm not thinking there's a silver bullet here or that we have a certain trick. I don't think there's anything that we're doing that other people aren't doing, but it's maybe more a case of just having the strong database behind us. And given that, we're able to measure horses, using the same consistent methods across those borders. So when you talk about international racing and things, we're sort of measuring those horses in the same database and using sort of uniformed data to measure those horses. So I suppose that's probably the Racing and Sports edge, if you like. So one example might be time. If the Aussie races are get out of the gate, scramble, find a position, settle for a 400, 600, 800 meters, and then sprint home. And the English racing might be cruising speed, and then from the 1,000 start sort of accelerating all the way. Does the time variance have any impact on that? Is it meaningful? Is it 1 or 2 seconds either way, or a half a second either way, which can be a number of lengths that you have to account for?
Yeah, I think there are differences in assessing time. Well, they're not differences in assessing time, but I think there are more races in the UK that are genuinely run. There's those big field handicaps where it's almost rare for them not to be truly run, whereas here we obviously have a lot of races that are not so truly run. I would think that here would be something like maybe a third, or maybe even a little bit less than a third of races that are really genuinely run, and in the UK that might be up more around 40%, a little bit more than that even. So maybe overall time is more important in the UK given that, or maybe overall time can be taken a bit more literally in the UK given that. And that's where sectional times here, obviously sectional time analysis is big in Australia, and I think that's probably the reason, because tempo obviously is such a key to overall time, and I think here we're probably a little bit more vulnerable to that because of that racing style.
What about subjective variables? Do you delve into that at all?
I try not necessarily in a rate. I mean, like everyone, I'm sort of having a guess when it comes to the subjectives, but try not to put them so much into a rating. As I said, you want your ratings to be as objective as possible, and you want them to be a really true representation of the form or the level of performance of the horse. So the subjective stuff probably comes later. So I think you need that consistent base, and then you can add a little bit of flair on top of that. That probably comes more in pre-race and sort of projecting the future, if you like.
So when you say it comes later, do you let it sort of filter into the market, and then if something like a Weir runner first up and you see there's money for it, you might add additional value, or even just intuitively sort of give it an extra tick in your mind? Or how do you go about doing it? Is it different each sort of variable?
Yeah, so I mean, from a pre-race perspective, I'm trying to, because we spend so much of my form is done in the post-race and in producing those ratings and trying to produce really accurate ratings. And as I said, I'm trying to eliminate the subjectivity at that point. Once you've got a really good set of objective ratings, I like the pre-race side of things. It's probably where I might be a little bit different to some, is I like a lot of that to be in the pre-race automated. So I think if you get a computer to automate your at least your primary assessment of races, you get that consistency, which you probably you're not going to get yourself just sort of using your intuition so much. So I'm rating races and then using that to automate a price line, and from there I can sort of massage that price line, if you like, to use my intuition, because you don't want to sort of stray. You don't want to be uncomfortable with your assessments, I suppose, is the right phrase. So I'm sort of trying to take that sort of very objective manual, like automated price line, and then massage it. Something like a Weir runner drifting is, I'm not going to get too worried about that. I don't think it's sort of, I mean, you're sort of going to see that. I think him specifically, Darren Weir runner specifically, first up, I think you're probably not that hot on a lot of his horses anyway. So it's probably, if they're drifting in the betting, you'd like to think that you'd already sort of predicted that to some extent. If market moves in the betting that were unpredicted and you're not sure why, that's probably then you might think about shouldering arms on the race.
So I want to talk specifically about two variables. The first one being tracks. Are they something that you can factor into a rating system, or is that something you would have to, this horse is good at this track for this reason, or is not good at this track for this reason? How do you go about dealing with that?
I suppose when you say reason, that's hard to sort of come to a real conclusion about that. I suppose you look at a horse like Grunt on the weekend who, two Caulfield runs were just okay. He gets back to Flemington where he won a Group 1 in the past and just explodes and wins another Group 1. And it's very easy to say, okay, well, Grunt is several lengths better horse at Flemington, but it's hard to sort of quantify that exactly. I think, again, it's not, you're just going to measure the post-race, and it's just going to be a coincidence that he's going to have high ratings at Flemington and maybe not so high ratings at Caulfield or something like that. But in the pre-race, it's a variable, a very small variable. I I wouldn't put too much weight into it, but I would think it's something that it's a variable in sort of creating a price line, a small one, and probably not one that's going to be any different to the betting market at large. I doubt there's really an edge in course form, if you like.
Yeah, because it's always something you hear on sort of mainstream content anyway. You know, oh, this horse is unbeaten at the track, or certainly down the Flemington Straight, you'll often hear, you know, Coolmore Day or whatever, that this horse is 2 from 2 down the straight, but it might be a very good horse if it's running in a Group 1 as a 3-year-old and it's run against some ordinary horses a few months earlier at Flemington, and of course it was going to win those races. So it's hard to, it's one of those things that always stands out to me. It's always something that's brought up. I mean, wet tracks might be one of them. That might be a whole different subject, but for some reason, you know, the tracks, you know, the performance at a track is always something that's relied on as a reliable form factor.
Yeah, and I'm sure there is some, you know, something behind the old saying, horses for courses. I'm sure it means something, and I'm sure there is I'm sure Grunt does prefer Flemington to Caulfield, but knowing exactly how much he prefers Flemington to Caulfield and predicting what that will mean for him and his ratings profile is a different beast altogether. And as I said, it's probably a small variable. I'm sure it's a small variable in a lot of big teams' models, but I wouldn't think it's a key variable by any stretch. And yeah, I think the market would do a pretty good job of just sort of snuffing that out and sort of adjusting for that.
And what about jockeys? If someone's having a poor stretch, is that an objective variable you can quantify and factor in, or is that something that you have to sort of assess? Or even, you know, Hugh Bowman, when Winks is running, doesn't want to necessarily get suspended for weeks down the road, or even, you know, get in too much trouble early on in the race day. Is that something you can assess, or is that something you leave to pre-race analysis?
Yeah, I think that's another pre-race thing. I mean, that's, if, you know, we'll say Hugh Bowman is riding poorly and he's not getting the best out of his horses, I mean, that'll bear out in their ratings. They'll return lower ratings if they're not getting the chance to run them. But I think, again, it's probably one of those things where, as you say, it gets a lot of mainstream attention, but actually quantifying it is a pretty difficult task. And it's, you know, you can get stuck chasing noise, I think, on a lot of these sort of things. I mean, Hugh Bowman doesn't ride well when Winks is around. You know, that's all well and good until he comes out and rides 4 or 5 winners and you've marked all these horses down 4 or 5 rolls and done your money. I sort of think it's as I said, it's another one of those things where there could well be something to it, but I think if you chase that much noise, you're going to tie yourself in knots and end up in, you know, too far away from your sort of fundamentals, if you like.
So for those that don't have the ability to curate a large database of information, or, you know, might be doing it part-time, are there a couple of variables that stand out from your perspective that are worth delving into in order to help make a 5 or 10 minute, you know, rating on a horse, let's say, if they're doing some quick analysis?
It's a good question. I suppose I'm very privileged to be working at Racing and Sports, where I have such deep sort of data, if you like, at my fingertips. I've sort of having sort of 5 minutes and having to key onto just one variable's not something I'm fortunate enough not to have had to sort of worry about that sort of thing. I suppose, I mean, there is a lot of, if you're in a position where you don't have a lot of time to sort of, as you say, nurture a full database, there's plenty of good stuff available, and it's probably a good chance for me to get in a little plug there for Racing and Sports. Racing and Sports has a really great free database online there that you can get pretty good access to. It's not going to be sort of tailored for you. We've got obviously a lot of users and you can't please everyone, but it's going to give you a head start, if you like. There's freely available ratings there that are pretty good, and they're going to give you a reasonable start, I would imagine. And then I think, you know, if you can take those ratings, and I think one of the really simple things is to use ratings and try and work on their relationship with the SP. So looking at sort of a prior expectation versus the output, if you like. And so if you take a rating and sort of use it, intertwine it a little bit with the SP for those runs, you can sort of start to work towards coming towards a rating that's meaningful in a predictive sense, if you like. So, you know, I suppose what I'm saying is if you get, you know, 2 horses with a rating of, say, 100 and one of them was, you know, ran 100 at even money and one of them ran 100 at 40 to 1, those ratings mean something different from a predictive sense. So you can, you know, that's a pretty easy thing to do. The SP is obviously widely available in form guides, and if you can get sort of your hands on a reasonable set of ratings, you can start to intertwine them, and I think you'll probably see yourself, with a pretty simple little model there, have a bit of success.
So how do you convert ratings into prices, or do you do that so you can assess, the market?
Yeah, well, I'm, as I said, lucky enough to be at Racing and Sports, where that first go for me is all automated by the computer, and there's some algorithms there put together. I know the concepts, but I'm lucky enough to have access to smarter minds than mine that can sort of crunch the maths on that sort of stuff, and on those sort of relationships, as I said, relationships between things like SP and ratings and sort of number of starts and ratings, and use that in a sort of mathematical predictive sense. So, I use that as a real starting point, and I don't like to stray too far from it. As I said, that consistency that you get with a sort of automated price line sort of guarantees that you do all that hard work sort of coming up with a good rating. You don't want to sort of stuff it up with the sort of pre-race assessment and by missing things, and the computer just won't do that.
So take me through 30 minutes before a race. You've got your prices, it sounds like, in your ratings, and you've done, or the computer's done a lot of the work for you. What are you looking for in that sort of period of time up until the jump? Are there things that are key components that you're always looking at and monitoring, or is it depends on the race?
Yeah, so to make sound judgments, I'll want to be prepared, I suppose, is the important thing. So 30 minutes before a race, I'll want to know exactly sort of what my game plan is there. So I'll have a plan, sort of a betting plan, if you like, and an idea of which races I want to target from the morning. And on a Saturday, I've got my eye on that from sort of 2 days out, if you like. So I'm sort of 30 minutes before a race, my prices are in. I've got my sort of generated prices off the ratings, if you like, and I've done my massaging by then. I've added my little bit of flair, which has hopefully sort of got them in the right space, and I sort of know which races I'm looking to target. So I'm just monitoring prices like everyone else, Betfair and dynamic odds, what have you, and just looking for that edge you need, I suppose, to sort of pull the trigger.
How far and wide are you going to gather information at that point? Are you looking at Twitter? Are you getting information from the yard, perhaps, or looking at the weather? Like, what type of information are you deeming relevant?
Yeah, betting markets are what I'm looking at that point. As I said, I've got a plan. Unless something large has sort of happened weather-wise, or there's something some genuine mail from the yard, if you like. I'm not wanting to sort of change my assessment at that point. And I've certainly got Twitter open because I suppose that's like the modern betting ring in a sense. I mean, people don't really go, not a lot anyway, go to the track to bet these days. So everyone's sort of at home on the computers in their bunkers, if you like, and Twitter's sort of the betting ring. So there's a lot of interesting stuff in there and a lot of fun stuff. And yeah, it's sort of a good distraction in between races, actually. And as I said, yeah, there is information there, but I'm pretty set in stone by sort of 30 minutes before the race. It's really just a matter of getting the price that I want.
How flexible are you with what your prices have and what you're seeing? If you see something drastic, whether it's track bias or other things that people talk about, will you sit out for the rest of the day if that's the case? Or if there's a deluge and you're not quite sure if you've got the right ratings for a wetter track than you expected, are you adjusting on the fly?
Yeah, so I suppose, I'll price races up the same on a heavy as I will on a good. I won't make a real, maybe a slight intuitive one, but not a massive change. So if it really rained on the day, and it will come down to feel with me. If I sort of think, well, this is, cyclonic at Flemington or something, maybe it's a day just to sort of not play, if you like. But for the most part, I suppose I'll just grit my teeth and charge on in. I think it'll sort of look after itself in a sense. You might back the odd horse that completely doesn't handle it, but there'll be plenty that you didn't like that won't handle it as well. So I'm happy enough to sort of just keep betting, if you like, through most of those. It's sort of one of those things where it doesn't really matter to me until it matters completely. And track bias is a little bit the same. I think track bias is, people are hunting for patterns with track bias, and I think we're way too quick to sort of screen bias, really. And we're probably hunting for those little, I understand that, everyone's looking for their edge, and for some people they're really good at spotting that stuff and they're really good at exploiting it. But for me, I'm not really, so I'm not going to spend huge chunks of time and energy sort of hunting for a half-length advantage, via lanes on the track on the day or anything like that. So again, track bias for me, it's not really relevant until it's completely relevant. And if there's a track that's just wind is probably the one, certainly in Melbourne, it's the one that causes the most havoc. And I suppose if it gets to a point where I think it's turning the races on their head, then maybe for me it's just a day to pack up shop completely.
Yeah, no, that makes sense. Do you think jockeys and trainers and other participants utilize certain narratives that would have an impact on the race? And one example that comes to mind from back in the day when I was living in Melbourne was efficient in the Derby when the wives' tales go that Lloyd told, I think it was Michael Rodd, to stay on the fence as long as possible, and then he obviously did, and it turned out very well, especially for those that backed efficient in that race. But that, I don't know the reason, and maybe it's public the reason, I'm not sure, but maybe it was because he thought the going was better on the inside. Maybe he wanted to save the horse for one last run because he wasn't sure as a 3-year-old he would get the full... Who knows? But it seems like a lot of the narratives, there's always two sides to every single story. Yeah,
and I suppose that's again where my view on jockeys, trainers, connections and the way they adapt to those sort of through-the-day narratives is probably too volatile, too extreme for my thinking. I think sometimes, wind is the one in Melbourne that seems to be in the headlines a lot of late. It seems to always be blowing a gale down there, and I think sometimes it's sort of a little bit overplayed. So again, it's sort of one of those things that doesn't matter until it matters a lot, and I think they start to act as if it's going to matter a lot before it really does. And I think you see some jockeys who just sort of take that out of the equation and just ride their horse. I think what you see sometimes is owners, connections, jockeys overthinking it to the point where they'll sort of cost their horse several lengths tactically to save half a length against the wind. We need cover from this wind, so I'll concede 6-8 lengths at the start to get this all-important cover and cost myself that 6-8 lengths to save, what might be half a length at most, and obviously that's dumb. So you see a little bit of that. That's probably more of an issue for me than the wind itself, because I'd like them just to, as I was saying with me and betting, I'd like them just to grit their teeth and get stuck in, and then what will be. But I understand that's probably not human nature.
Yeah, no, that makes sense. And then you said post-race is the most important for you. Do you do anything unique, or are you just crunching all the numbers, so to speak, and trying to ensure you have all the right information ready for the next start?
Yeah, that's hard for me to say whether it's unique. I suspect sort of, but not entirely. It's we have a good system at Racing and Sports for getting that data in and managing it. And that's a large chunk of my week is spent managing that data. It's a big database. Obviously, we're covering 12 racing jurisdictions around the world, so there's a lot of data in there that sort of needs to be managed and then interpreted. But we've again got pretty good systems in place to sort of rate and assess those meetings pretty quickly.
Let's talk price. Unlike bookies and totes, the Betfair exchange is a low-margin, buy-sell fixed odds marketplace where the value stays with the punter, not the house. Ready for the game within the game? Join betfair.com.au. Gamble responsibly.
So do you go back into the past and adjust different ratings based on what you've seen after more starts of a horse, for example?
Yeah, absolutely, and particularly with lightly raced horses. So when you're rating a race, those ratings, you're taking as many sort of data points, if you like, within that race to sort of, the more data points you touch on, the closer to the truth you'll get. And I suppose when you get those lightly raced horses, you don't have quite so many points of reference, if you like, and as we see more of them, we get more and more points of reference. So, yeah, it's a good idea to go back and to sort of make adjustments. Those ratings, particularly for young horses, have an error margin for sure, and you can sort of find that down with more information. So we'll do that for sure. And then we use those races, obviously, as a reference point for the following seasons as well. So it's important that we have them right, so we've got strong references for the future as well.
Yeah, I don't know that many people maybe don't have the time or the ability to go and do that. But if you think a race is a hot form race and the first 5 or 6 out of that race will be strongly contesting their next start or should be well in the market, and then it turns out it wasn't, it obviously has a multiple effect moving forward if you don't adjust it.
Yeah, absolutely right. It'll have a knock-on effect, and I mean, part of the ratings process is not just times and sectionals, it's also that collateral form. So if you've got horses, and races rated too high and horses coming out of those races that are incorrectly rated, you'll have a skewed prior, if you like, going into the rating the next race. You have a skewed range of possible values for that horse going forward. So you need to make sure you go and get those as close to right as you can, for sure, because it does have that knock-on effect, and if you let that go unchecked, obviously knock on onto knock on, and you'll find yourself with some exponential trouble.
Speaking more generally about the industry, do you find that it's healthy and it's moving forward and it's on a good path, good trajectory, or is it the alternative, or is it somewhere in the middle? There's a lot of discussion about how things need to be or should be heading or aren't heading or are heading. What are your thoughts?
Yeah, my answer is always going to be somewhere in the middle. I probably don't have enough information to speak with huge authority on it, but I think there are certainly parts of the industry that are good. I think there are parts of the industry that are certainly going along much better than the sort of public the racing public, if you like, would think. I think the sport's pretty well covered. There's always room for improvement, of course, but I think it does a reasonable job of sort of projecting itself out there. It's got free-to-air coverage in Australia, and through newspaper attention and online, it's got pretty good coverage, and I think it's going okay. There's always room for improvement, of course. I'd love to see racing puff its chest out a little bit more and be a little bit more confident about itself. I think, I'm obviously a hard fan of racing, and I'd like to see racing be more confident in itself and what it's about. I'd like to see it be more confident in the betting side of the game, and you only have to look at the success of corporate bookmakers to know that I think society is sort of averse to the betting game as maybe racing, portrays. I sometimes feel like racing's a little bit shy in sort of promoting itself down those lines, but it's a great game. It's a fun game, and it's a game, beats the hell out of Sudoku, and I would imagine that a lot of people feel the same way, and I'd like to see racing certainly promoting that.
Are there any other areas for you that would be, valuable for them to add? And, like you said, there's free-to-air vision, there's barrier trial vision in many respects, there's times, there's different form outlets you can get access to, there's bookmakers, there's totes, there's exchanges, there's a lot of information online, there's also a lot of noise, which is good and bad, but are there other things that you could point to and say, look, this would be a great thing to have in, 2018 and beyond?
Yeah, I mean, I suppose the obvious one as a punter in Victoria is sort of more official trials and things like that. And for me, it's not even a case of, we've got good vision now, but there's always, demand for more and for more official trials and that sort of thing, and less sort of unseen runners at the races. That's always a big one. And so you talk about noise. For me, the more information that's out in the marketplace, the better. And it's not even necessarily that I want it or that I want to use it. I'm not going to be, I'm not going to be trawling through jump outs necessarily. That's just not my go. But I want other people to be trawling through jump outs and betting on them, and I want other people to have access to sectional times so they can interpret them their way, and because I want to bet against those people as well. So I think there's, you want information out there not just for yourself, but for the health of the whole betting market, and something to, I suppose we're all in this because we think we're the best at interpreting it, and I want other people to have, that little bit of information as well, so they're more confident to be on the other side of the bet, if you like.
So I started doing sort of quick fire or word association questions at the end of podcasts as of basically now. So before we get into that, I've got a few that I'll fire out for you. I wanted to ask about racing and sports. I mean, we touched on it a little bit before, but what's the sort of competitive edge for you guys and what you're up to? You mentioned Gary before, and I know you got a pretty good team there. What's something that's different tools that are useful for punters if they haven't been on there extensively already?
Yeah, good timing, because we've just launched our new site, which is hopefully a great tool for punters there, with a lot of good quality form, but also a lot of interactivity with that form. We've got the sort of the old Don Scott worksheets, if you like. They're still a great tool. That was sort of what I've first started off those sort of cold nights at the bookies there, finding my feet on the English races, was using Don Scott worksheets on racing and sports. They're a great way to price up races, and you can still use them, successfully. And as I said, they're all interactive, so are the speed maps and a few other things on the website there. So I think the interactive form that we have there, and then hopefully it's, as I said, we've got a new website now, racingandsports.com, and hopefully it's a pretty clean website and a pretty intuitive website, easy website for people to use, and I think it's, I'm pretty upbeat about it and think that people can, people really enjoy it.
Awesome. Everyone should go and check it out. So before we finish up, I'll just fire a few questions and words at you, and first thing that comes to mind, you can take 30 seconds or 3 minutes, whatever you prefer. Does that sound good?
Yeah, it won't make for great podcasting if I take 3 minutes. But
So who's the best horse outside of the normal answers of Winx and Black Caviar and Maccabi Diva?
The best horse, So You Think was my local favourite, and I still think what he did overseas is massively undersold. I thought he was everything about racing for me. He was, he was an athletic rock star. He looked fantastic, and he won plenty of races and conquered plenty of worlds and took everything on as well. So he was outstanding. So You Think sort of he's my champ.
What do you think the racing industry will be like after Winx retires?
The first thing that popped into my head was better, but that's probably a little bit unfair. I mean, she's fantastic, obviously, and
better prices. Certainly.
But, she sort of crawls a few great betting races there, doesn't she? So that was the first thing that popped into my head was better, even though I don't want to be seen as a Winx hater. I think she's awesome, but she's obviously, for the betting side of the game, she's the Cox Plate this year would be such a hot betting heat if not for the 10s on favourite that's just going to whip them all. So that's probably the first thing that sprung to mind.
Do you remember your first quaddie win?
I do, but it was a treble back in the days. I was at Canberra Racecourse with the old man. I remember getting, I reckon it was something like $80 to $100, and I was absolutely pumped. And I think Tanter Lane won the Rose Hill Guineas, so I'm not sure what year that was. I'm good at old races. I'm not good at years, but I'm pretty sure Tanter Lane won the Rose Hill Guineas, and I jagged the treble that day.
Beautiful. One underrated horse for the upcoming Spring Carnival, Melbourne or Sydney?
Underrated horse. A horse I like from Saturday is a horse called Good and Fast for David Hayes. He was behind Brutal, and I think Brutal was terrific. He dug in and did a great job. But I thought Good and Fast was sneaky good in behind him there, and he'll go on for that. And then the winner of the last on Saturday as well, Fury, and he's a star in the making. So I think Saturday can throw up a couple of pretty handy ones there.
Gay Waterhouse in her prime, Chris Waller in his prime. Who would you prefer to train any horse?
Ooh, I'll say Gay runs on the board and longevity. I suppose, Chris is starting to get into the longevity stakes as well, isn't he? But I suppose time is the great tester of all of these, and she's still there, and she's still hard to beat whenever she gets a good one. So I'll say Gay.
You own the favourite in the Doncaster, and you've got to pick J-Mac or Bowman. Who are you putting on the horse?
J-Mac, for sure. I mean, it's not a knock on Hugh Bowman, who's a really good jockey, but I think James McDonald, when he gets a little bit of continuity back and back riding, I think he could just about make a case he might be the most talented jockey in the world. So I'll say J-Mac for sure.
Do horses retire too early?
I think we have more of an issue with losing horses to Hong Kong than the breeding barn. In truth, we lose a couple of stars for sure. I mean, I was a little dirty when they retired Flying Artie because I was convinced he was a really good horse in the making, and we never got to see the best of him. And there are several like him, I suppose. But I think we're losing a lot of horses to Hong Kong, and that's where you're losing the guts of the races there, if you like. So yeah, I'm not stamping my foot about that quite as much as maybe some.
Would you prefer to own the winner of an Arc or the Caulfield Cup?
The Arc for me. I'll have both, but I'd love to win the Arc. I think that'd be it. I think that'd be the pinnacle race for me anywhere on the planet. I'd like, obviously to own an Arc winner. I get to take him home as well, right? So I've got plenty more good things in store as well.
No doubt. Last one for you, Tom Melbourne.
He's fantastic. I think. I feel a little bit sorry for him that he hasn't won, but he gets a massive tick for consistency, doesn't he? And I think where he gets a little knocked for maybe turning it up, I think that's just how good he is. I think he might be genuine, but he's genuinely he sort of suffers for being so honest. Perhaps he puts himself in great positions to run second. It's not easy to run second in those good races. So yeah, I think he's a good horse. He's probably a little harshly dealt with.
Yeah, is it one of those narrative things that it's just kind of a weird random sample that he just has a lot of seconds and it might just be luck more than anything or randomness? Yeah,
I think if you're good to a certain level, like he's good, like on a time form scale, I think he's 116 or something like that. That's not quite good enough to beat a horse like Coming Through, who's 121, but it's good enough to beat most horses, and that's where he gets himself into those winning positions, if you like. He's good enough to get himself in the finish of all these races, but not good enough perhaps to win them all the time. And he's so genuine that he's always running up to something like his mark and getting himself in the finish. So there's something admirable about that.
So that's the end of this little segment. I don't know how well that went. We'll see what the feedback's like. But before I let you go, I wanted to ask, when you're consuming different content around horse racing or betting, or not at all in that area, if you're not interested in that in terms of public content, but what sort of attracts your eye, or what do you read or listen to or watch when you're in that area?
So I read a lot, but not necessarily about horse racing. But the podcast here is pretty great. I've listened to half a dozen of these in the past, and podcasts, I suppose, are, I walk the dog, throw the earphones in, and that's a pretty easy way to sort of get a little bit of, on here you've got stories like, with different punters and things like that. And I listen to, it's called RSN's Correct Weight, for just a recap of the day before, which is, got Dean Lester and what have you on, and they do a pretty good job recapping the day before, which is, good background noise for a dog walk for sure.
Awesome. Adam, thank you very much for your time. Appreciate you coming on to the podcast and having a chat, and good luck with the upcoming Spring Carnival.
Yeah, it's been an absolute pleasure. Thanks, Jake.